They said the devil himself had touched the child in the womb. In the spring of 1847, on a cotton plantation outside Natchez, Mississippi, a slave woman named Ruth gave birth to a boy whose skin was the color of moonlight on water. His hair grew in white wisps, fine as spider silk, and when he opened his eyes for the first time, they were the palest pink anyone had ever seen, like something not quite finished, not quite human. The midwife, an elderly woman who had delivered more babies than she could count, dropped the infant back into his mother's arms and fled the cabin, muttering prayers that sounded more like curses. They named him Moses, after the child pulled from the river, but there would be no promised land for this boy. The night of his birth, a storm rolled across the Mississippi Delta. Lightning split the sky in jagged white scars, and thunder shook the slave quarters until the walls trembled. Old folks would later say that nature itself had recoiled at the child's arrival, that the heavens wept in confusion at what had been brought into the world. Master Halloway's prize mare gave birth to a stillborn foal that same night. 3 chickens in the yard were found dead come morning, their necks twisted backward. Coincidence, some said. Omen, said others. Ruth held her baby close through that long, terrible night, whispering to him that he was perfect, that he was loved, even as the world outside seemed to scream that he was neither. Moses grew up knowing he was different in ways that went beyond the obvious brutality of his station, while other enslaved children on the Mercy Plantation learned early to make themselves invisible to the white folks who owned them. Moses could never hide. His appearance demanded attention, commanded it really, in a way that made everyone deeply uncomfortable. The sun was his first enemy. By age 3, his mother learned that even brief exposure left his skin blistered and raw, peeling away in sheets that made the other children stare and whisper. She made him clothes that covered every inch of skin, fashioned hats with brims so wide they cast his face in perpetual shadow. The other enslaved people began calling him Ghost Boy when they thought Ruth couldn't hear. By the time he was 9 years old, Moses had learned to read the fear in people's eyes before they even spoke. He saw it in the way mothers pulled their children behind them when he passed. He felt it in the silence that fell over the quarters when he entered. Even the dogs on the plantation would whine and slink away when he approached, their instincts telling them something was wrong, though they couldn't name what. The other enslaved people kept their distance, though not out of cruelty. His mother said it was protection, for him and for them. "You draw the eye, child," she would whisper to him in the dark of their cabin, "and eyes bring trouble. The white folks already watching us every minute of every day. You make them watch harder, wonder harder. That wondering gets people killed." She was right. Master Halloway, who owned Mercy Plantation and the 140 souls who worked it, would cross himself whenever Moses passed. The gesture was small but deliberate. 3 fingers to forehead, chest, shoulder, shoulder, as if warding off evil spirits. His lips would move in silent prayer, and his eyes would never quite land on the boy's face, as if direct eye contact might somehow contaminate him. The mistress of the house, a thin woman with a face like carved ivory and a voice like breaking glass, once screamed when she encountered the boy in the kitchen house. He'd been sent to fetch water, a simple errand, but when she turned and saw him standing there, she let out a shriek that brought 3 servants running. The pot of scalding soup she'd been stirring crashed to the floor, sending a river of liquid across the boards. She pointed at Moses with a shaking finger, unable to form words, her mouth working soundlessly. After that, Moses was forbidden from entering the main house at all. A new rule was posted in the kitchen. The pale boy was to remain in the fields, away from the family's sight. But it was the overseer, a thick-necked man named Garrett, with hands like ham hocks and breath that smelled of tobacco and rot, who was the worst. "That boy ain't natural," he would say, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Seen plenty of colored folk in my time, but that's something else. Something wrong, something that needs to be watched." Garrett took it upon himself to do the watching. He would follow Moses through the fields, standing close enough that the boy could feel his presence like heat from a fire. "What are you?" he'd whisper. "What kind of creature did your mama birth?" Moses learned not to answer, not to react. Any response only made it worse. The enslaved community had their own explanations, passed in whispers after the sun went down and the white folks had retired to their big house on the hill. Some said Ruth had been cursed by a conjure woman before Moses was born, though no one could say why or when or what Ruth might have done to deserve such a fate. The story changed depending on who told it. In some versions, Ruth had stolen another woman's man. In others, she'd refused to share her healing knowledge. The details shifted like smoke, but the conclusion remained the same. The boy was cursed. Others claimed the child had been touched by a restless spirit, a haint that had left its mark on his flesh. They said a white overseer had died in the cabin where Ruth lived, years before Moses was born. The man had been beating a slave when his heart simply stopped, dropping him dead where he stood. Some said his spirit lingered, angry and confused, and had somehow entered the child in Ruth's womb, bleaching him from the inside out. Old Samuel, who was nearly blind and claimed to remember Africa, said the boy carried the blood of the ancient ones, spirits that walked between worlds. Samuel had been on the plantation longer than anyone could remember, so old that even Master Halloway's father had known him as an old man. When Samuel spoke, people listened, even if they didn't always understand. "He got one foot in this world and one foot someplace else," Samuel would say, his milky eyes seeming to look past Moses rather than at him. That's why he looked the way he do. He caught between. The ancestors marked him special. Whether that special is blessed or cursed, I couldn't tell you. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe just different, and different is its own kind of hard in this world. The white folks had their own theories, none of them kind. Reverend Pritchard, who came to the plantation once a month to preach about obedience and the natural order of things, declared Moses an abomination, the sins of Ham made manifest, he called him, citing scripture with the confidence of a man who'd never questioned anything in his life. He said the boy's appearance was evidence of some terrible transgression, though he couldn't quite name what. "God marks the wicked," he'd proclaim from his makeshift pulpit in the barn. "He marks them so the righteous can see and turn away." The plantation owner's son, Thomas Halloway, a young man of 20, with more cruelty than sense and a drinking problem that grew worse each year, had his own explanation. "I heard about this," he announced one evening at supper, his words slightly slurred with whiskey. "There's beasts in Africa, pale as ghosts, that the darkies worship, white apes they call them. Some kind of demon creatures. This boy's got that beast blood in him. Makes him dangerous, makes him unpredictable." His father nodded grimly. Keep him away from the other children. No telling what he might do. Keep him in the far fields where we can watch him. And so Moses worked the farthest cotton fields, the ones closest to the swamp where the water was thick and green and the air hung heavy with mosquitoes. He worked alone, mostly, with only the sun to keep him company. And the sun, as always, was merciless. The trouble came, as trouble always did, on a day that started like any other. It was late summer, the air thick enough to choke on. Moses had been sent to work in the far fields, picking cotton under a sun that scorched his sensitive skin until it blistered and bled. His mother had made him a wide-brimmed hat from scraps, and he wrapped his arms in rags. But it was never enough. The other workers watched him with a mixture of pity and unease as he labored, his pale hands turning red and raw, his fingers bleeding where the sharp cotton bolls cut into them. Around midday, when the heat was at its worst and the air shimmered with it, Thomas Halloway rode out to the fields on his black gelding. He was drunk. Everyone could tell by the way he swayed in the saddle. And mean as always, he liked to watch the enslaved people work, liked to remind them of his power, with the crack of his riding crop against his boots. The sound would echo across the fields like gunshots, making people flinch and work faster. But that day, his attention fixed on Moses. "Come here, boy," he called out, his voice carrying across the rows of cotton. Moses knew better than to disobey. He set down his cotton sack and walked over, keeping his eyes on the ground as he'd been taught. Never look a white man in the eye. Never give them a reason. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." The words sent ice through Moses's veins. It was a trap, the kind white men set when they wanted an excuse to punish someone. Look down and you're being disrespectful. Look up and you're being insolent. There was no right answer. Slowly Moses raised his eyes. The sun was behind him, and when Thomas looked into those pale pink irises, something seemed to shift in his face. His expression went from cruel amusement to something else, something like fear or recognition or both. Later, people would swear the boy had done something, cast some kind of spell or curse. They'd say his eyes had glowed, that his lips had moved in strange incantations, that the air around him had grown cold despite the summer heat. But Moses had only looked at him, nothing more. Just looked, the way he'd been commanded to. Thomas's horse reared suddenly, violently. The black gelding screamed, a sound horses shouldn't make, and twisted in the air. Thomas, caught off guard and unsteady from drink, was thrown clear out of the saddle. He landed hard in the dusty field, with a sound like a sack of grain hitting the ground. His leg bent at an unnatural angle, the bone visible through torn flesh. He screamed, a high, terrible sound that sent birds exploding from the trees. The horse bolted, eyes rolling white, foam flying from its mouth. It galloped across the field and didn't stop until it reached the barn, where it stood trembling and wild-eyed, refusing to let anyone near it for hours. And Moses just stood there, staring, his pale face expressionless in the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. "The demon child did this," Thomas shrieked when they carried him back to the house on a makeshift stretcher. I looked in his eyes and saw hell itself. He made the horse throw me, used his devil magic. I felt it, felt something cold go through me. He cursed me. The doctor came from town, set the leg, administered laudanum for the pain. But Thomas kept screaming about the pale boy, about the curse, about the evil that walked among them wearing human skin. His fever climbed through the night, and in his delirium, he raved about demons and portents and divine punishment. There was no trial, no questions asked, no investigation. By sunset, men had gathered at the plantation house, neighbors, poor whites from town, even the sheriff with his silver star pinned to his chest. They came with torches and ropes, their faces hard with righteous fury. And something else, relief. Relief that they finally had an excuse to deal with the thing that had made them uncomfortable for 9 long years. Moses was nowhere to be found. Ruth had run with him the moment she heard Thomas's screams, knowing exactly what would come next. She'd spent 9 years preparing for this moment, knowing it was inevitable. They fled into the woods behind the plantation, following the creek north as darkness fell. She had a sister in Tennessee, she told him, though she'd never met her and wasn't sure she was still alive. They would find a way to reach her. They had to. But the dogs found them first. The baying echoed through the night, getting closer. Ruth pushed Moses ahead of her, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Run, baby," she pleaded. "Don't stop running." "Mama, I can't leave you." "You have to." She grabbed his face in her hands, looked into those strange pale eyes that had cursed him from birth. Her thumbs traced his cheeks, memorizing the feel of him. "You're special, Moses. Not evil, not wrong, special. You hear me? Don't let them make you believe different. You are my son, and you are perfect, and you are loved. Now run." The dogs burst through the undergrowth behind them, all teeth and fury. Ruth turned to face them, and Moses ran. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs went numb, until the sounds of the hunt faded behind him. He ran through creeks and over rocks, just as his mother had taught him during their whispered preparations. When dawn broke, gray and cold, he finally collapsed in a hollow tree, his body shaking with exhaustion and grief. Behind him, the dogs had stopped barking. No one knows exactly what became of Moses after that night. Some say he died in the woods, that his body was found weeks later, picked clean by animals, identifiable only by the scraps of clothing that Ruth had made for him. Others claim he was captured and sold south, to the sugarcane fields of Louisiana, where people disappeared and were forgotten, where the mortality rate was so high that no one asked questions about new workers. But there were stories, strange stories that spread through the slave quarters of Mississippi and beyond. They said a pale boy, thin as death itself, had been seen at the edges of plantations at night. He would appear to enslaved children who were being beaten, to women being violated, to men dying in the fields. He never spoke. But his presence seemed to bring a kind of peace, a momentary relief from suffering. Some said just seeing him reminded them that they weren't alone, that their pain was witnessed, that they mattered. Some claimed to have spoken to him. They said his eyes held ancient sorrow, but also something else, a strength that couldn't be broken, a spirit that refused to be crushed. They said he helped people escape, guiding them through the woods to freedom. He knew the paths, they said, knew where to cross rivers and where the patrols wouldn't go. A ghost boy, they called him. A guardian angel cursed to walk the earth. The stories multiplied and changed. In some, he had wings. In others, he could walk through walls. Some said he died saving his mother from the dogs, that his spirit couldn't rest until all enslaved people were free. Others insisted he lived, that he'd made it north and was helping others follow. In 1863, when Union soldiers marched through Mississippi, an elderly former slave named Ruth was found living alone in a cabin near Natchez. She was nearly blind and spoke rarely, but when asked about her children, she would only smile and say, "My Moses crossed over to the other side. He's free now. The soldiers asked if he died or escaped north. She just kept smiling. No one knew if she meant he was dead or if he'd made it north to freedom. Perhaps, in the end, there was no difference. Perhaps freedom and death were the same thing for people who'd never known a day without chains. There's a cemetery outside Natchez where slaves from Mercy Plantation were buried in unmarked graves. The earth there is red clay, and nothing much grows except wild grass and the occasional stubborn magnolia. Sometimes locals say you can see a figure there at twilight, a pale, thin shape standing among the stones. When you approach, it vanishes like morning mist burning off a lake. They say it's Moses, still waiting for his mother. Or perhaps he's waiting for something else, for the world to finally see him not as a demon or an aberration, but as what he always was. A child who wanted nothing more than to be free. A boy who loved his mother and feared the sun, and carried the weight of everyone's fears and superstitions on shoulders too young and too thin to bear them. The truth about Moses, whether he lived or died, whether he escaped or was caught, whether his mother survived that night or perished defending him, has been lost to history. But his story remains, passed down through generations, changing with each telling, but never losing its essential truth. That fear of difference is a kind of violence, that hatred needs no justification beyond the visible, that being born wrong can be a death sentence. In the end, Moses was guilty of only one crime, being born into a world that feared what it couldn't understand, that destroyed what it couldn't categorize, that called evil what was simply different. And for that, he paid the highest price. Some nights, when the wind blows through the delta and the moon hangs low and pale in the sky, people swear they can hear a woman singing. The song has no words, just a melody that sounds like grief and hope tangled together. They say it's Ruth, calling her son home. And if you listen very carefully, on the quietest nights, you might hear another voice joining hers, high and clear and young, answering across the darkness, saying, "I'm here, Mama, I'm still here."